Okay, welcome to Chapter 12. This is continuing our series of lectures on Introduction to Criminal Justice. The basis of these lectures are the text by Cengage, 11th edition. Publisher is Cengage. The authors are Larry Gaines and Roger Leroy Miller. This is the 11th edition. We're recording these in June of 2022. So we'll be integrating some of the ongoing stories. For those of you unfamiliar, we just had the hand down of the rather dramatic change of abortion law in the United States, the abolition of the constitutional right to abortion, established in the famous case of Roe v. Wade and now overturned. So not a lot to do with probation there, but we'll take a look and see if we can integrate any of that in. Okay, so the thing I always do is I offer some questions to ask. First of all, does probation really qualify as punishment or rehabilitation? When you're talking about not going to prison or not imposing the death penalty or not imposing corporal punishment, which are the traditional understanding of what punishment is, and it's very often not aimed at changing behavior. Is probation, what is it? What is its function? What is its purpose? And I think that's an overarching question to ask as we look at this chapter. The second question is what crimes would deserve probation and which incarceration? How do you distinguish between the two options? Why would, say, a nonviolent crime call for probation, but a violent crime call for incarceration? And I think that's kind of a logical statement, but why? Why do we answer that in the affirmative? Does probation widen the net? Well, we're going to talk about that pretty much at the end of this lecture, but widen the net mean bringing more crimes under the criminal law because you have the option of probation. Are some probation sentences better handled in civil court? Should probation be changed in some way? Should we move some things that are now classified as a crime? Let's just take a simple one like speeding. Should that become a civil offense? And final question, why did we get rid of parole? Parole was something that was pretty common going all the way back to its English and Australian roots and now has largely disappeared. So why? What happened and why? Okay, we've got our classic learning objectives. These are just topics we're going to cover and the framework within which we operate. Not important for you directly to see this. Okay. Probation, not prohibition. Probation is by far the most common sentence. It's what happens to most people. There are about 4 million offenders out there, 3.8 million, who are not behind bars but are on some type of probation. So that's easily twice the prison population. Depends whether you count jail in those numbers. So it is, as I said, the most common thing. We're going to see some graphs about this, but there's 4 million people on probation. And if you look at the adult population in the United States, that's approaching 2% of the adult population. There's another 850,000 who have been paroled. So you add these two together, and you're definitely over 2% of the population is on probation and parole. Taken together, these two terms, probation and parole, are known broadly as community corrections because, as you can see, the individual isn't in isolation in jail. He's not been removed from the society. Rather, he is serving his time out in the larger community. So we call it community corrections. Okay, why probation? Well, here are some of the things that are talked about why we're going to have probation. And probably I would say the first and foremost would be that it's cheaper. That's the last one there, but I do think that it's probably the driving option here because it's very expensive to put people in prison and there are limits onto how many we can have. But it does believe in reintegration. That is preparing the offender to return to the community, and that the community won't won't have any sort of repercussions because of that. They won't have future crimes. So reintegration also kind of assumes or predicts rehabilitation. The second thing is diversion. Now, diversion really is getting those people who it makes very little sense to send to a prison or a jail and moving them out of a formal incarceration, diverting those away towards community-based. Um, and finally, it's very much the low-cost alternative. If you look at some of the most recent numbers, yeah, I found some from North Carolina. North Carolina spends about 37,000, I think $37,713 per person we incarcerate. Um, Now contrast that to what do we spend in North Carolina for putting someone in community corrections, and it's under $2,000. So if we play with those numbers very roughly, I think it's actually 1,874, but if we play with those numbers very roughly, $40,000 in North Carolina to put someone in jail or prison, $2,000 to put them on probation or parole. Okay, so it's, there's just a massive difference. It's 5% of the cost. Um, Also, you have to think that someone out on probation and parole, not only is he costing you 95% less than he's in prison, but he could be earning a job and paying taxes. So, in fact, he might be a net positive economically. Now, this is an economic reason, not a criminological reason, but it's certainly one of the things, one of the reasons we do this. I would say probably the dominant reason. You are definitely between two worlds here. If you are on probation or parole, what you're going to find is that you're being supervised by a probation officer and you're subject to conditions that others of us who've never been placed on probation or parole are not. So, quick example there. If you have someone on probation or parole from, for an offense involving drinking, it's certainly possible that one of the conditions would be that you don't go to a bar, that you do not get drunk. Now, if you're not on probation or parole, if you want to go to a bar and get drunk, that's perfectly okay. Now, the theory, of course, too, is between these two worlds is not only can it be more economically beneficial, we just talked about, 95% savings, but it's more humane. Prison is not a nice place. Jail is not a nice place. For certain crimes that really don't call for this um, almost draconian option of prison or jail, this seems a more humane thing. Now, in practice, some of these conditions can be quite severe and really can have very dramatic impacts on people's lives. Okay, who gets probation? So if we look at, and I pulled some numbers for Texas, and one of the things I want to do is I pulled some for race. Um, You'll notice that the state population of Texas um, is roughly 45% white, but there is 33% of the people in prison um, are white. And if you look at the percentage who are black, it's about 12%, but 32%. So you see you're vastly overrepresented racially in Texas. Now, the other one I put in here, because I think this is pretty interesting, is look at parole on the other hand. Those numbers are much closer. I mean, they're still skewed, but they're much closer to what one would expect. In fact, you could see that the Hispanic number is actually below what we would expect in the population, and the black numbers are probably still twice what we want if everything was equal. And the white numbers are roughly 50% lower than you would think, but the Hispanic numbers are the same, and these are much less dramatic differences. And this is going to get to, if you recall, the last lecture we talked about the chivalry effect, where we incarcerate women differently than men. Also, I think you're going to find that there's more probation parole for women than there are for men because they're just deemed to be less of a threat and less violent. Okay, so I did find some charts for North Carolina. As I said, probation is the most common form. if we look at the roughly 160,000 people that are in prisons in North Carolina, and these numbers, as I said, are pre-COVID, so take it with a grain of salt, you'll notice that in our prison systems on any given day, there's about 36,000 people. And remember, you got to multiply that 36,000, okay, times roughly $40,000 each. So, we're looking at over, what is it, 1.2 billion, something like that? 40,360, 36, yeah. Yeah, roughly almost $1 billion it's costing us to run our prisons and state systems. Our jails, 19,000. Those on parole, 12,000. We do have some parole. There's some federal prisoners in North Carolina. We have some federal institutions. But you can see that the largest slice again of this pie is definitely probation, 81,000, slightly more than half. Okay, so there are different alternative models that we could talk about here. I'm not going to spend a heck of a lot of time on these, but basically you've got split sentences, sometimes called shock incarceration, or also called where you put them in and they are exposed to it, but they're let out. It's not a true parole system. And then there's intermediate incarceration, where you split your time between jail and outside. This is typically serving on weekends. You'll often see this in North Carolina, or used to at least, for drunk driving, so that you would report in the weekends. You'd spend your weekends in jail, but you would be out in the general public otherwise. When do we deny probation? Well, first of all, if someone has been convicted of multiple offenses, that's a pretty common reason that we do it. So, if you've got someone that committed 4 rapes or 3 burglaries or 6 burglaries, that's a good reason not to give them probation. If you're already on parole or probation when you commit a new crime, that's a good reason you're not going to get probation. If you have 2 or more past convictions, that's a good reason. Narcotics addiction, very common reason to deny it. Any sort of serious physical injury, a stabbing, a shooting, a murder, those are all going to be denied probation almost all the time. Or if you use a weapon, because often, like North Carolina, has a sentencing enhancement where you've got a 60-month addition if you use a firearm in your crime. Very, very common. All right, so imposing these conditions, the judge here has tremendous powers. If he's going to have, if he's going to impose prohibition as opposed to prison, he feels like, at least the society feels like, he's doing the guy a favor, so he should be able to almost tailor make the conditions of the probation. Now, there's going to be some standard ones, but there's going to be some others. It might be I've seen probation conditions like you have to attend an anger management workshops, or you have to go to a drug and alcohol assessment and work on issues like that. And this essentially can be seen as almost a contractual relationship. Now, there are obviously standard conditions as to what you're going to see. Almost always there are things like you're going to get a job, you're going to be so gainful employment being one. You can't have commit a criminal act. Often you can't associate with some people. Now, also sometimes we have punitive conditions that we impose. If it's serious, these can include things like mandatory drug testing or even home confinement. And treatment conditions are very common, since many of our crimes seem linked to issues of addiction, either drug or alcohol. We often mandate as a probation that you obtain or get counseling. When I used to do drunk driving cases, one of the mitigating factors in your sentencing was had you had a drug and alcohol assessment. So I would always send clients to get one first, even before it was imposed as a condition, because it was going to be ordered as a condition anyway, right? And you were going to have to pay for it. But if you did it before, you would get a lighter sentence. So pretty common that we ordered treatment. So common things you have: reporting to a parole officer, paying court costs, getting treatment, keeping a job, not committing other crimes, don't associate with criminals, and keeping curfews. All these are very common conditions of probation. So let's talk about the probation officer in this whole, and he's kind of wearing two hats. Um, he First of all, before there's any sort of probation imposed, he often investigates the background of the individual and prepares, if you recall, I think we talked about some of these before, the pre-sentencing investigation report, the PIR. And it'll say things like, okay, this guy has a stable home life, or this guy has a job, or this guy is supporting a family, or none of those things. This guy doesn't have a job, he has an addiction problem, he has these issues, and then the judge can look at that investigation and say, this guy is a good candidate for probation, or he isn't. Finally, after actual sentencing, the probation officer is the guy that's going to make sure that you follow the rules, that you indeed do what you are required to do, and that you're not just, you say you're not drinking, you say you're going to counseling. This is going to make sure you are. Now, in smaller agencies, smaller areas, very often an officer will do both of these things. But in larger cities and larger counties, typically they're unique and separate jobs. Even when he's doing the second part, which is supervising people on probation, there is a split in what he does. And by that I mean, think about it. He's got this guy he's working with, and most of these are going to be men. He's got this guy he's working with, and he's hoping that he can help him get through the probation. He can, make sure that this guy straightens out his life. On the other hand, he also has to be guarding the larger community. So, is he going to err on the side of helping a guy out if he has, one difficult situation, if he slips up one time and gets drunk? Or is he going to be much more concerned about the community? Which does he do? And so it's a role conflict. Now, there is a caseload dilemma that we can talk about a little bit here. And this is a pretty serious problem. The caseload is the number of clients that you're responsible for at one time. And because, like almost all government agencies, you're going to get the famous line, we want you to do more with less, it's so much easier to just give them more and more people to supervise. So there is the American Association of Probation and Parole Officers, the APPA, says if they're monitoring a dangerous offender, someone that maybe had committed an act of violence, and they're out on probation, they shouldn't, and this is usually how many they have at a given instance, so we'll say in a month, you shouldn't be monitoring more than about 20 of those. Now that would mean in a month, let's just break it down. Let's just suppose it's a standard month with 4 weeks in the month, 40 hours a week. Okay, so that's 160 months, 160 hours in that month for those 20 offenders. That means 8 of those hours, or a full day. Now, obviously, you would spread it out. You could be doing things like, I'm going to go to his job and physically check to make sure he's there. I'm going to go I'm going to go see his therapist to make sure he's attending therapy. I'm going to go, see how he's doing medically. I'm going to go interview his family to make sure there's no problems. Now, if you have someone that's maybe a little violent but not psychopathically dangerous, they can handle a few more. And if they're handling like a non-violent offender, they can handle 200. But that's very high. And of course, if you were to give someone, 200 violent offenders to watch, well, as opposed to having an hour, they're only going to have 8 hours in a month. They're going to have less than an hour. So this is a very serious problem. The actual caseload is running, as opposed to what we want at 60, it's running at about as 20. It's running at 60, and for some states it's way over 200. I've seen numbers of over 300. So the caseloads can be pretty serious. All right, what happens when we revoke? And that's really going to be um, someone's on probation and we decide that they didn't live up to the conditions and now we're going to send them to prison. This is revocation. So one of the things your book talks about, and I think this is an interesting one, is it talks about debtor's prison. Now, way back in the 1800s, um, you could go to jail if you owed money. Oh, you owe money to someone you can't pay, you're going to prison. Now, we technically abolished that in the 1830s. Um, and, some states even say there can be no imprisonment for debt. You can't put people in jail because they owe money. But in reality, that's not true because the example in your book was there was an individual, I think his name was Thomas Barrett, was arrested for stealing a can of beer, and he got a $200 fine. Okay, so now here's the thing, and I've talked about this before, is that your fine is bad, but there's all these court costs, and in this case, they started charging him a private probation service fee because the state of Georgia didn't want to pay for a salary to someone, so they hired a corporation, and they were charging him $360 a month. Now, what eventually happened with him is he couldn't come up with that money. He couldn't um, he couldn't pay. So he wound up owing thousands of dollars, more than $1,000 in fees, and they said, "Okay, you revoke your probation, you're going to jail." So what you're really doing there is, yeah, you've got debtor's prison again. So offenders can fail or have their probation revoked for different reasons. Now, the decision usually means you're going to have a revocation hearing, and the probation officer is going to have to recommend that. And it's going to be done if you violate it either for something serious or technical violation, or even, as I said, not paying the cost of your probation. Now, in the 1960s, we decided that we were going to set certain um, conditions. We were going to decide the way we do this should be monitored by the courts. And this is really the period in the 1960s when the Supreme Court was very interested in due process. So in Memphis v. Ray, 1967, you had a constitutional right to be represented at your probation hearing, revocation hearing. And then in 72 and 73, the Brewer and the Schiaparelli case, they say you're going to have a three-stage model of due process. And here it is. You're going to have a preliminary hearing, and that first is, okay, did you screw up? And the second one is, okay, we think you screwed up, so we're going to have a formal hearing. This is going to be in front of a judge to pull your probation. And it's going to be kind of like a mini trial. Now, you've already been convicted of a crime. Here we're trying to see, did you break your probation? So it's not as formal, but it's got a lot of the trappings of it. And then there's going to be a sentencing where they say, yes, you're going to lose probation, or no, you're not. You can go back out, or you go to prison. And the thing about that is, remember, there's no presumption of innocence here. You've already had your trial. There's going to be at least a record of it. And the judge is going to have to say, this is why I revoked probation. All right, so the obvious question here is, does this thing work? We've been doing probation for, more than 100 years. Does it really work? Well, does it prevent recidivism? Um, are you really going to stop people in the future from committing crimes? Now, the most recent data I've seen is about 11% of people arrested for a violent crime, and 13% of those arrested for murder were on probation when it happened. Now, I guess you could say it this way: 90% weren't. But is it really working? Effective probation really has to include monitoring and behavior change, and it's really got to be aimed to, you can't overload the people monitoring it. So here are your risk factors. These are just a few. Well, first of all, unemployment and substance abuse. Obviously, if your life is that difficult, if you don't have a job, if you have an addiction issue, it's going to make it really high probability, first of all, that you're going to commit a crime in the first place, but second of all, that you're going to break probation and wind up losing it. Social support for crime. This would include friends um, who are offenders, or you live in an area that really says, crime is okay. Maybe you live in an area where, the mountains of North Carolina, where moonshining is just an acceptable behavior. Yeah, you ran a still, no big deal. Um, Pro-criminal attitudes, which would be like, do you have a disrespect for authority? Do you rationalize your criminal behavior? And finally, the antisocial personality pattern. Now, at the low level, this is not necessarily a psychological diagnosis. It can mean things like you're impulsive or a pleasure seeker, as they sometimes say, irritable, or aggressive, and it can go all the way up to a true asocial personality disorder, or what we called in the bad old days schizophrenia. No, excuse me, not schizophrenia. Um, Psychotic behavior. Oh, gosh, it's a sociopathic behavior was the old term for it. Okay, so let's look a little bit about parole. Um, Parole is really based upon three concepts. Grace, you've got no right to it, but we're going to give you this privilege. And contract, you're going to consent to it. We're going to enter into a contract, an agreement, and you're going to abide by it. And custody, you are still technically under custody. So in probation versus parole, first of all, and one of the things is there is no more federal parole, they got rid of it, is in parole you are going to prison first, or jail. And then, if we want, through grace, we can let you out early. So the difference is probation is imposed by a judge. It happens in court before usually you go to prison or jail. Parole, on the other hand, goes after you go to jail. You have been in prison. Now, decisions on parole vary. Some states use parole boards, some use special panels. Um, it because we got 50 states, we've got 50 different ways in we do this. Um, North Carolina parole law, let's talk a little bit about this. North Carolina has the Structured Sentencing Act of 1984, and what we do is we set up it's kind of truth in sentencing. We say if someone's going to go to prison, they're not going to get parole until they serve 85% of their sentence. So you're not getting out super early. And typically a commission reviews your behavior. It's 4 people appointed by the governor. They review cases once a year, and when they say they review it, they'll let people come in. They'll let the victim come in. They'll let arresting officers come in. They'll look at the individual's crime. They'll look at his previous record. Importantly, I would say maybe most importantly in a lot of cases, what's his conduct been in prison? This is where if you're a good person in prison, you can earn the right of parole. Other states can use other things. There are parole boards. Some use firm release dates. Again, there's the limited term, the governors. So there's a number of options. Okay, what are the typical factors considered in parole? What did you do in the first place, and what's your attitude towards it? What was your prior criminal record? What's your attitude towards the victim and the victim's family? This is particularly important if you have a intimate relation with the victim. What is your physical, mental, and emotional health? How did you behave in prison? Did you try to reform? Did you try to improve yourself? And what does the victim want here? Is the victim willing to forgive you? Is the victim willing to move forward? Or does the victim say, I'm not comfortable with him being out of prison? All right, so you're going to have a discretionary release, is basically what we call it. The entire parole board will review the information. They're going to meet the offender. They're going to hear testimony, and they're going to decide. Now, if they're going to deny it, usually it's denied, like I said, because you were bad in prison. That's why it's really important. Or, and I think this is controlling for very serious crimes like rape or murder, because you have a horrific underlying crime. Many states have moved towards no more discretionary release. We're not going to make value judgments. You're going to serve this time. A offenders serve their full length of their sentence minus any good time adjustments, and you're going to know your presumptive date when you enter prison if you're a good person. Um, Parole boards were just seen as inaccurate methods of prediction. Um, they just weren't very good at their job, so they've gradually, I think, largely been replaced. All right, now sometimes, unfortunately, the individual who is under parole probation doesn't live up to the conditions. So the conditions, as I said, of parole can be very similar to the conditions of probation. Classic one is holding a job, not committing another crime is another one, and this contractual relationship. Now, usually, when do you lose parole? Well, the biggie is you commit some crime on the outside. So if you're on parole because you had committed an armed robbery or something, and you go out on parole and we catch you drunk driving, we can revoke your parole. Now, sometimes it's a technical violation. It's something maybe more minor. You were supposed to report once a month to your parole officer and you were 2 days late. That's a technical violation. At that point, you're going to have some discretion. If you are on parole and you commit a murder, there's no discretion. Your parole's gone. But if you're 2 days late reporting to your parole officer, there's going to be some wiggle room there. There's going to be some discretion, some option of mercy, I would say, or grace. So intermediate sanctions, many people feel that these intermediate sanctions, and we're going to start including things other than the probation and parole. And these include things like, here are a quickie list: fines, which are very, very common, community service, restitution, forfeiture, and pretrial diversion. So, in particular, that last one there is something when I would represent juveniles, we did a lot of. We really felt sometimes that it was a bad idea that an offender went through a formal trial, particularly at a certain age, and if we could avoid getting a criminal record for them, and if we could get them to recognize it's a mistake, that was a big thing we did. So pretrial diversion, very important, very often for juveniles. Usually you see pretrial diversions only for people who are young or first-time offenders. And it can be things like, even somewhat serious, it can be things like illegal drug use, sometimes some domestic abuse cases, some sexual misconduct cases like indecent exposure in public or something. And they usually require very extensive counseling. Now, problem-solving courts are a little different. So there's a couple of these states use some different ones. We have some unique courts in North Carolina. We have a business court, but one of the most common ones is a drug court, where either after you're arrested or you're convicted, they give the option to the person. You can go through the drug court program, or you can go through the standard one. Now, if you go through the drug court, you're going to get more emphasis on treatment to try to cure the addiction. And if you complete the program, very often they drop the charges. Now, forfeiture got very popular, and it created some kind of perverse incentives. But it really starts back in the 70s. And you can actually trace it all the way back to the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organization Act, which was passed by Congress in that year. And it said if there's a criminal case, the judge can implement forfeiture. So let's suppose you are smuggling drugs in the United States, and you're doing it on a boat, and we catch you. Well, not only can we seize the drugs, they're illegal to possess, we can arrest you, but we can seize the boat, and the boat can be forfeited to the government or the state. Now, once it's forfeited, the government can sell it, and very often that property is given to the police. And since you can create kind of a perverse incentive, It's very financially rewarding for local police agencies, and one of the things you'll see is that um, it's almost better for them to get forfeiture than anything else. Like, oh, we need to have money for, something new in our police department. Well, let's go out there and find a lot of forfeiture crime. I don't think it's ever quite that. Well, it might be in some cases, but I don't think it's ever quite that um, obvious. But it can happen. But forfeiture is essentially a way to hit people where it hurts with their money. Some other options we can talk about is day reporting centers. And these are really, since jails and prisons are expensive and they're overcrowded, um, basically these are, as opposed to going to jail or to prison, you're going to spend most of your day or each day inside a reporting center. So it's probably one of the most intense forms of supervision. And there can be treatment inside during the day. Now, you may go home to sleep at night, but you're going to be there during the day. Um, Now, the criticisms of this is day reporting center. You're often there with other criminals. Sometimes you're not undergoing treatment or monitoring, so you can network. I mean, that's a classic business term, but you can sit there and make connections. Oh, you deal meth? Hey, I deal crack. Let's get together. We'll mix our products together and sell them the same. Now, the next thing to talk about is intensive supervision. This is more punishment oriented, where you're placed under very strict and frequent surveillance. And um, there's lots of face to face contact between the offenders and officers. Um, so, again, this would be where there would be only 20 offenders that the probation officer is watching. And it's going to be very much, we've got our thumb on you, we're keeping an eye on you. Continuing on to some more options, we've got shock incarceration, where we're going to throw you into a prison to shock you about how hard it is and how tough it is. And again, this is something we tend to see aimed at youthful offenders, people who are teenagers. A little bit less common for older adults. I suppose it exists. I haven't seen a lot of it. Um, we even do sometimes the boot camp, and the boot camp model was the idea that you could run people through a boot camp, and then since it was a grueling physical condition, and it would change their attitudes. And actually, the first this is going to be a bit of a digression, but the first time we did these, we asked for volunteers. We ran them through. A lot of them dropped out, but when we looked at the people who graduated and then we followed them long term, it seemed like, very, very, very low recidivism rates. And all of a sudden, people said, bingo, the military boot camp is the model we can do to stop recidivism. And we started sentencing people, not just volunteers, to boot camp. And then when we turned around and looked at the results, what we found is they weren't that great. And I think the answer there is because it was a poorly designed study. When you say, okay, who wants to volunteer for this? The people who are going to volunteer to go through 16 weeks or 18 weeks or 26 weeks of a boot camp to get out of prison early or avoid prison, they're already motivated. I think you're already dealing with a population that's probably going to have a lower recidivism rate. When you just say, hey, everybody's going to go, there's nothing magical about boot camp that makes you a better person. Okay, we've got home confinement. This is another community-based sanction in which you're going to actually serve your incarceration at home. Now, this is incredibly cheap, and all 50 states and the federal government have it. Um, and in fact, about a third of everybody who's on probation or parole is under home monitoring. And home monitoring really has different levels. You've just some at a very simple level is just a curfew. You got to be in at specific hours. So one of the things in a drunk driving case you would see is you can't be out after night unless you're going to job. And then you can see home detention, which you have to remain your home at all times, except usually you'll have conditions like you can go out to go to school, to get to work at your job, if you're attending counseling, or sometimes specific things like getting food and going to church. A step up from there is home incarceration, where you can't get out for anything except a medical emergency. So when we talk about home confinement, there's like the three kind of levels: curfew, home detention, home incarceration. Um, the electronic monitoring, there's lots of different monitorings when we look at electronic monitorings. Um, and the, there are really two. There's a what's called sometimes the program monitoring or the programmed contact system, in which you will get a periodic call, usually at your house when people used to have landlines and stuff, to say, "Are you there?" and you got to verify it. The other option is what's the continuous signaling or continuous monitoring, where you're constantly going to have an electronic device that tells people where you are, and that's very often the kind of anklet you see people wear. So, home detention, you're going to remain at home with some exceptions except school. Home incarceration, you're there all the time unless monitoring, and we do have the general electronic monitoring. Okay, the last thing I really want to talk about is widening in that. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about this concept because it's one that's easy to overlook. And to use a crude example, it works like this. If I said in a given city or county or state there was 100 jail cells, and that if you were going to make something illegal and you can only fill up 100 jail cells, um, you're going to have to say to yourself, well, I'm going to make something really important like murder a crime. I'm going to make rape a crime. I'm going to put people in the jail cells. But, I don't have the room in the jail cells to make something like, I'm trying to think of a silly North Carolina crime, gathering pine straw without the permission of landholder, which is technically a crime in North Carolina. That's kind of hard to say. Well, as opposed to having room for a rapist in jail or a murderer in jail, I'll put the guy who stole pine straw. So um, when you say, oh, wait a minute, as opposed to putting that guy in jail, let's make it a probation offense. And all of a sudden, because you have the intermediate sanctions, you can have more people convicted of more crimes because you can make more things crime. You've just got more room. So, as more and more alternatives to jail and prison exist, you can expand the number of people that you bring under supervision. Now, the next thing is really a technological conundrum or problem, and that's the net gets stronger. If you look at what we expected out of people, um, 50 or 100 years ago on probation and parole, it was relatively simple, relatively straightforward. But and part of the reason for that is I couldn't tell if you did everything. If I said, well, you have to attend a correspondence course, you have to attend religious services weekly. Well, there's no way I can monitor that in 1920, short of having a corrections officer follows you to your job. So fast forward to today, if you think about the cell phone you've got in your pocket, I can tell where you are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, at any given time. You've all gotten a notification. Hey, you just visited the, Duck Donuts, or you just visited McDonald's. Did you enjoy the McFlurry you bought? And that's because your phone can monitor you. Well, think about how we can now, using this type of technology, even more impose conditions on people, strengthening the net, as it's called. Get more involved in the lives of your citizens. So, for example, let's suppose that let's take the Supreme Court case that just came down to make this a little bit real, and let's suppose that the state you live in makes abortion illegal. And let's suppose that you travel out of state, and you go out of state, and while you're out of state, you buy at a pharmacy across the state border pills to end a abortion. So this is a drug-induced abortion. And now you come back to the state of North Carolina. Let's suppose North Carolina is the state we're talking about. Well, we could know that by looking at your phone. We could say, oh, you went to the CVS pharmacy up in Virginia or down in South Carolina. Your purchase, because we'll know what your purchase is, was the abortion pill. You came back into North Carolina. You called out sick for 2 days. You must have taken those pills in North Carolina. That's a criminal act. You're under arrest. Or let's suppose you're a woman on probation or parole. You violated it. Or let's suppose you're a man who, for their wife or their girlfriend, had gone to one of these pharmacies, bought that pill, brought it back to North Carolina, gave it to your girlfriend, wife. Congratulations, you've broken the law. So you can see how technology would allow us to be much, much more intrusive. It could tell us things like, did you go to an ABC store in North Carolina when you're not supposed to drink? Did you place a bet? Did you buy a lottery ticket when you're not supposed to gamble? And it can be something nice like, did you really go to your therapy appointments? Did you really go to your drug and alcohol assessment treating? So these are all issues when we start looking at it. Probation and parole has these both powerful for good and powerful for bad factors. We can bring more people into the system. That may mean we help more people. It may mean we hurt more people. We can strengthen the net. We can make sure people live up to conditions, but we also can impose more and more conditions that make it more difficult for them to live up to everything. So widening the net, strengthening the net, two significant issues. So the final thing your book talks about is the paradox here. The ability to monitor someone on release is being increased by technology. And because of this technology, we will detect more violations. We will keep finding more and more people, at least in technical violation of their parole. And what that's going to mean is you can revoke more probation. And remember now, that's going to carry a financial cost. We're going to shift from paying $40,000 a year in prison, or $2,000 a year for probation or parole, to $40,000 for prison. So it's going to be more expensive, and it's going to be more intrusive. The problem of, for example, trying to set any sort of limits here is you're going to be subject to that dreaded challenge that all politicians are afraid of. You're soft on crime. If you don't include more conditions, if you don't act like you're being tough, you may not get reelected because people want to believe that these conditions fight crime. Okay, well, that keeps us right at about 50 minutes where I like. When you come back, we're going to pick up with the next chapter, where we're actually moving in the next unit into prisons and jails. So we've pretty much run the gauntlet with the correction system, the sentencing. We kind of bridged over. We talk about this most common one, probation, but now we're going to get into the nitty and the gritty of prisons and jails. And the first, chapter 13, we're going to look at will be the prisons and jails themselves, and then 14, we're going to actually look at what it's like to live in these things. All right, well, whenever you're ready, you can log on to those. Those shows will be up and available to you. And if I don't see you, have a good day, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, great weekend, or holiday if it's a holiday weekend for you.